myself. Some of you will no doubt be wondering why some guy with a Yorkshire accent is going to tell you all about Baltimore and the O'Driscoll clan, okay? So, my relationship with Baltimore and the O'Driscoll clan is I came here just like all you guys for the O'Driscoll clan gathering. My first one was in 2001. Came to the area, loved the area, and kept coming back, and I was fortunate enough to meet my lovely wife Donna, and it was Donna's parents who renovated Séad Castle. This is their home, and I'll get more onto that in a minute. So I have to confess, I've got real imposter syndrome standing here in front of you all right now. We've had some great guest speakers over the years. A few years ago we had Clive Driscoll. If you've not heard of him, he was a fabulous London policeman, and he solved the mystery or led to the conviction of people responsible for a young fella called Stephen Lawrence. So a lot of you will know the story. He was a fabulous speaker. Another one we had was Des Eakin. I'll talk a little bit about the Sack of Baltimore in a few minutes. He wrote a wonderful book, if you've not come across it, called The Stolen Village. A brilliant story all about the pirate raid that happened here in 1631. So you were another great speaker. For me personally, the best and most relevant speaker that I've witnessed here was my mother-in-law, Bernie. Bernie wrote a book about Baltimore Castle, and it's not just about Baltimore Castle, it's about the history of the place. And I just found it so relevant as a tourist or as an O'Driscoll on my pilgrimage back here. So basically I'm going to try and base my talk on her talk. I found it relevant and I hope you all guys do too. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start way back about 10,000 years ago. I'm going to bring you up to speed to Baltimore in the present day. Okay. So quick history lesson. Humans first come into Ireland 8,000 BC, 10,000 years ago, after the last great ice age. The ice sheets retreated northwards and humans come in. So the first humans who come into Ireland come over on the short, it could have been a short walk or it could have been a short boat crossing. Sea levels were very low back then from what is now Britain, okay? So when these people first came in, what they find is that Ireland is a very forested country, okay? So very difficult to navigate around unless you're using the water. So these people, they settle by the rivers and by the sea. But a lot of the archaeology associated with the people has been lost. You know, sea levels were a good 5 to 10 metres lower than they are today, okay? And they didn't leave much. These guys were hunter-gatherers. They moved around a lot. They didn't leave much evidence of their existence, okay? So over the centuries, there's many more people come into Ireland, waves of invasion. It weren't like the first people coming 8,000 years ago, that were the Irish people, you know? It took a lot of people to actually make us who we are today. They come in. But it's not until about 4000 BC when a wave of invaders or migrants, whatever you want to term them, they come into what is Ireland, and they bring farming with them. And when they start farming, they build permanent settlements. So that's when we first start seeing real archaeology. So in this area, the first bit of archaeology we see associated with that time is a passage tomb. Which is up near the causeway that links the mainland with Ringaroga Island, which is just to the north of us. Ringaroga would not have been an island historically, you know, rising sea levels over the centuries have cut it off. But there's a passage tomb there, which is basically an artificial cave where cremations or bones of the ancestors would have been laid to rest there. And that dates from about 3,500 BC, but it's only visible at low tide. It's obviously covered by water these days, so at low tide you can just see the remains of it. High tide you can't see anything of it at all. Coming near into the village, we have a ring fort. If you've not been to it, if you head for the lifeboat station, there's a field just to the right before you meet the lifeboat station, and if you look in the far corner, you'll see a little sign that takes you to a ring fort. What a ring fort is, essentially it's an enclosed farmstead, and these were circular in construction, an earthen bank with a timber palisade on top, and then you'd have a dwelling house and associated farm buildings in the middle. So ours is a bit of an enigma. There are about 45,000 ring fort sites in Ireland, and they date from between the 5th and 10th centuries typically. We've had a couple of archaeologists look at ours, and because its size is smaller than a traditional ring fort, some people have surmised it could be an Iron or Bronze Age construction. We don't really know. We had a geophysical survey done on it last year, and that yielded a bit of information. We've got a further one this year, and hopefully we'll do a community dig sometime next year see if we can find something we can carbon date, and we'll be able to know what this thing actually is, okay? Out on Cape Clear, a lot of you be aware there's some standing stones on there. They're from about 1000 BC. One of them has a hole cut in it. It's a pair of stones, one with a hole cut in it. And it's believed these are marriage stones. You know, the bride and groom in pagan times could have put their hands through, bound in cloth, and that would have signified the marriage, okay? So if you've got any interest, you just Google it and you'll find more information on those things. Which brings us on to Séad Castle, which is probably the most visible piece of archaeology, if you want to term it that, in the area, okay? And this place dates from 1215. So, Séad Castle. Séad means Fort of the Jewels. Why it's called Fort of the Jewels? Well, we think it's because it's made out of the red sandstone bedrock that it sits on. And when it's freshly cut, it glistens. It exposes quartz, known as Kerry diamond, and it glistens. So when this place was first constructed, you can imagine it really would have shone in the sunlight, okay? So this place was constructed by the Anglo-Normans. So I'll just briefly, for anybody who's not aware, who the Anglo-Normans were. The Anglo-Normans invaded Ireland, 3 waves of invasion really, in 1169, 1170 and 1171. And the background to the invasion is, well, first of all, Henry II, he's the King of England at the time, and he'd been looking for an excuse to invade Ireland for some time. In 1155, he'd been awarded a papal bull, a licence basically by Pope Adrian IV, allowing him to invade Ireland. From the church's point of view, because Ireland had never come under the control of the Roman Empire, the church here was independent of Rome, and Rome didn't like that at all, so they wanted to bring that into their realm. From King Henry's point of view, he basically, the feudal system, the way it works in England at that time, you sit as a king, you sit on top of some wealthy barons who are power hungry. You know, so he's kind of thinking, you know, if I can get these guys over there, you know, carve out their own little territories, you know, get them out of my backyard, it keeps my throne secure. So he's awarded this papal bull in 1155, but he doesn't act upon it until he's approached for help by Dermot MacMorrough. So prior to the Anglo-Norman invasion, Ireland is a series of kingdoms, okay? So you've got a system where clan chieftains, so like the O'Driscoll clan chieftain, for example, he'd have paid homage to provincial kings. So anybody who's familiar with Game of Thrones, Ireland is very much set up like that at that time. It's a very, very violent society. So the kingdoms that really matter at that time are Connacht, Ulster, Munster, Leinster, Meath, and then Dublin's like an independent state with a Viking king, basically. So Dermot MacMorrough is the King of Leinster, and he's allied with the King of Ulster, okay? Now, the King of Ulster is defeated by the Kings of Meath and Connacht, okay, if you can follow me. And Dermot MacMorrough has to basically run for his life, okay? He's outnumbered. The alliances that he's been a part of, they've gone now, okay? So he flees to England to seek help, and from England, he finds his way to France, where King Henry II holds his court. Now, this is where sometimes I get booed or jeered by Republicans, Irish Republicans, for what I'm going to say next. But I have to defend the country of my birth. Everybody goes on about the English invasion, the Anglo-Norman invasion. When you look at these people, there's nothing very English about them at all, okay? The Normans are Vikings who settled in France, so they're French-speaking Vikings, okay? They move into England. The people who Dermot MacMorrough seeks for help are based in Wales, so it really is a Welsh, French, Viking invasion, and the English have not much to do with it at all. But they've suffered, you know, they suffered. The English came in and this and that. But when you look at it, this is who these people were. Okay. So Dermot MacMorrough, he persuades a number of Norman barons to help him. So the one most associated with the Anglo-Norman invasion is Strongbow, Richard de Clare. Everybody gives him the credit for it. But the first wave of invasion actually led by a guy called Robert Fitzstephen in 1169. Strongbow follows 1170. Henry II comes in 1171. Having granted his barons permission to come over to Ireland, Henry II thinks, hang on a minute, you know, these guys are over there carving out their own power bases. I better go and let them know who's boss. And then this sets off 800 years, basically, of English paranoia. They're always worried about invasion coming from Ireland into England, so he comes over. So anyway, back to this guy, Robert Fitzstephen. He comes over here, and within a few years, you might have heard the phrase that the Anglo-Normans became more Irish than the Irish. This certainly was true of Robert Fitzstephen. Within a few years, he's been described as degenerated into mere Irish. So he's dressing like the Irish, he's talking Irish, riding his horse like the Irish, and he's called himself McSlaney, the Irish version of Fitzstephen. And it's one of his descendants, Slaney, who builds Doonshade Castle in 1215. It's recorded in the Annals of Inishfollen that he builds Doonshade and Doonanaul on Ringaroga, just to the north of us there. Doonanaul means fort of the foreigners. Okay. So when the Anglo-Normans come into what is now West Cork, we think it was a relatively peaceful incursion through a number of reasons. First, when the Anglo-Normans get here, they build castles all over the place straight away. You cannot build castles while you're fighting the locals. You can only build castles in a time of peace. Okay. Secondly, we know that the two branches I better be quiet. I was going to badmouth the McCarthys then, but I don't know set my in-laws. So how we would term this diplomatically. Two branches of the McCarthy clan were fighting each other at the time. Okay, so while they're busy fighting each other, they're not looking at the horizon and the Anglo-Normans coming over it. It's actually written in the annals that the Anglo-Normans were assisting on both sides of this McCarthy dispute, so they were playing the guys off against each other, basically, you know. So while they're fighting each other, the Anglo-Normans, we're in, no bother. And also when they come in here, the Anglo-Normans, there's lots of intermarriage between the Anglo-Normans and the local Irish clans at that time. So certainly the Slaney who builds this place, he's married the daughter of the local McCarthy chieftain. So we've not much evidence of the relationship between the O'Driscolls who were here and the Anglo-Normans at the time. You know, they would have lived side by side. You know, some people have, they always say that they had no interaction between them. You know, the Irish clans would have done their thing, the Anglo-Normans would have done their thing, but it's complete rubbish because there were lots of intermarriage. We know they were dealing with each other, they were interacting with each other. So the Anglo-Normans in this area, they lived quite peacefully side by side with the Irish clans for a period of about 50 years until one of the McCarthy clan is killed by an Anglo-Norman and it sends the McCarthys into rebellion. So the McCarthys, aided by the local clans, the O'Driscolls, O'Manis, O'Donovans, O'Donohues, O'Sullivans, you know, clans who would have traditionally been fighting each other, on this occasion they actually join forces and they defeat the Anglo-Normans at the Battle of Callan in 1261, which is up near Kenmare. And it's written in the annals that the foreigners, the Anglo-Normans, were dispossessed of their castles at this time. So we think the O'Driscolls probably took possession of Doonashade at that time. Okay, so this becomes the principal castle of the O'Driscoll clan, the chieftain's residence. And then the O'Driscolls have it good for a period of 350 years or so when they become very powerful, very rich, as definitely the most powerful seafaring clan Ireland's ever seen. So, who are the O'Driscolls? Well, what we know about them is they were the chief family of the Corklee. The Corklee was a tribal grouping that extended a massive range all the way from Kinsale through to Kenmare. And they were the chief family of that territory. Now, prior to the Norman invasion over the centuries, this territory had been encroached upon by the Oinocta or Oganocta, people pronounce it differently, but they were a tribal grouping based up in Cashel, and they moved south over the centuries and encroached on Corklee territory. And the Oinocta, they gave rise to the families like the McCarthys, the O'Sullivans, all the other local clans in this area, but the O'Driscolls were here first, there's no doubt about that, okay? And then again with Anglo-Norman invasion, 1169, that encroaches on the O'Driscoll territory further. So by the time the O'Driscolls take possession of Doonashade, what the O'Driscolls are left with as far as the territory is Baltimore, Shirkin, Cape Clear, Affidown, just north of the Island River there, and Castlehaven, which is modern day Castle Townsend. Okay, that were their territory. So, you know, you'll be fully aware, if you've got O'Driscoll ancestry, this is where your family are from. You know, your family would have seen that view. You look up to Shirkin and Ringaroga today, you know, that's not changed at all. You know, they looked at exactly that same scenery. So I'll tell you before I go into the O'Driscolls and their activity, I suppose the first notable O'Driscoll of note was St. Kieran or Kiron, depending on how you want to pronounce it. So St. Kieran was born in Cape Clear in 353 AD. and obviously Ireland at that time would have been a pagan country. But St. Ciarán is described as a very spiritual person. And he goes to continental Europe on a spiritual journey, and while he's there, he becomes a Christian. He converts to Christianity, and he's one of the first bishops to come back into Ireland. So we think he got back here in 402 AD. So it's written in the annals that he converted the chieftains of his mother's tribe. So his mother was Corkali, his father was from a different tribe. But he converted the chieftains of his mother's tribe race to convert to Christianity. So the O'Driscolls, Corkali, would have turned to Christianity before most of the other Irish clans. And so I think St. Patrick, he doesn't get back here until 420. I think that's right. So anyway, the O'Driscolls, they've taken possession of Séad Castle, and as I said, they became very rich and very powerful. And they did this through a variety of means. Firstly, through legitimate trade. Back then, clans' wealth would have been measured in cattle. The O'Driscolls, they were kind of forced into this territory, and it wouldn't have been much good for cattle back then at all, okay? So they had to turn the sea to the sea for a living. So they controlled this harbour first and foremost, and all the little crooks and nannies and havens. So legitimate trade at that time, exports from Irish ports would have been wool, salted fish, hides. The chief import was wine. And it's, you know, all the stories associated with the O'Driscolls seem to revolve around wine, and you know, it's no exaggeration. I tell these stories, and people seem to think I've cherry-picked the stories about wine, but it's not. It's the only stories that are available, like, you know. So they're importing wine. Come in, so they get rich from that trade. Also from the fishing trade. Again, they control these waters. Anybody who wanted to fish in these waters, the O'Driscolls would have demanded that they buy a licence to fish in these waters. The O'Driscolls then would have charged them to land the catch, salt the fish, dry the nets, etc., etc., etc. They got richer for all this activity. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, is piracy. The O'Driscolls were pirates. There's no other word to term it, basically. Anybody who came into O'Driscoll waters were fair game. Back in medieval Europe, any shipping coming up from the south, from the Iberian Peninsula, would have used Cape Clear as a marker before turning east. Once you're in these waters, you are fair game for the O'Driscolls, okay? So the O'Driscolls, they would have had spotters all around the coastline here. As soon as they saw shipping in their area, they would have been out there looking for fishing boats, obviously, or trying to fish without buying a licence. But any shipping, the O'Driscolls would have gone out and they'd have demanded a little bit of tribute for fair passage. There's numerous instances of the British government, British authorities, speaking about the menace of the O'Driscoll nation, the nation of the O'Driscolls, because they are such a menace to English shipping at that time. And all this activity, it brings them into conflict with the city of Waterford. So the first recorded raid by the O'Driscolls on Waterford is about 1070, and Waterford at that time would have been a Viking city. But whatever sparked this raid, no idea, but it did. When the Anglo-Normans come in, Waterford becomes a very English city. And there's numerous accounts of the O'Driscolls going and attacking Waterford, and the guys from Waterford coming down and attacking us. So I'll talk about a couple of these raids, very significant. But before I do that, just one instance. Again, this is going back to the wine and the O'Driscolls' love of wine. Back in the 14th century, the chieftain at the time was a Donegal O'Driscoll, and he took a shipment of wine from Gascony in France, but he had no means to pay for it. Okay, so rather than refuse the shipment, he gave his young son as security. So off he went to Gascony with the French captain, and he spent many, many years down there before he returned. Okay, the O'Driscolls eventually paid for the wine, and he came back. But he was known as Angascunach, the Gascon, for the rest of his life. So the little stretch of water between Cape Clear and Sherkin Island, that's known as Gasconan Sound after this guy. Okay, so Waterford and the O'Driscolls raids. If you ever go to Waterford, there's a brilliant medieval museum in the heart of the city, okay, and walk around, as I've done. There's not much mention of this conflict with the O'Driscolls until you go to the audio-visual display and you go in there and it talks about these raids. And it actually mentions one, and it was a successful raid by the O'Driscolls, and it was the 4th of September 1368. The O'Driscolls went up there, and they teamed up. The O'Driscolls had allies, the Powers, who were an Anglo-Norman family, but they were allies of the O'Driscolls. The Powers had no love for the merchants, English merchants of Waterford at all, and they attacked the city, and it left many Waterford merchants dead. Now, in the museum, there is a model of Waterford, the city as it was at the time, and it's a proper walled city, so you can only imagine the military strength of the O'Driscolls to be able to mount an attack like that on such a well-defended city. Okay? So that was a successful attack by the O'Driscolls. They weren't always successful. You know, lots of people killed in many of these raids over the centuries. One of the raids by the guys from Waterford here, a very significant event, was Christmas Day 1413. And the guys from Waterford, led by their mayor, a guy called Simon Wickham, sailed into the harbour here. And on Christmas Day, they came up to the castle and they approached the guard, or the porter, as is described, and said, Christmas Day, we've come with a gift of wine for the O'Driscolls, will you let us in? And the man let him in. So this little door in the corner here, that was the main entrance to the castle back then. So the guys from Waterford, they came in here, and it describes how the O'Driscolls were feasting on Christmas Day. So the O'Driscolls, they were all around where you are now. They sat at boards. They would have feasted off basically little boards like trays, I suppose. That's what they've been feasting. And as soon as they saw these guys, their enemies from Waterford, come in, they obviously were alarmed and thought, God, what are these guys doing here? And the guys from Waterford said, no, it's Christmas Day. You know, I know we've had our differences in the past, but we've come with a gift of wine. You know, let's make merry and let's get up to dance and let's be friends. And as soon as the O'Driscolls get up to dance with the man from Waterford, they're clapped in irons and taken back to Waterford, and they're held hostage. They are eventually ransomed. They come back, but they're there. But where this is really significant is this is one of the first, if not the first, recorded evidence of people dancing in Ireland. Now, people would have danced before that date, but it was perhaps viewed as immoral by the church, and that's why it's not really recorded. So a very significant event. And I can assure you all, on Christmas Day, we always have a little dance in here, so we keep that tradition going. And we look out for men from Waterford. We're a bit well guarded these days. So again, another significant date really with the O'Driscolls and the Waterford feud is 1537, and this really puts an end to the feud. The O'Driscolls made a catastrophic mistake on this one, but as I said, they have spotters all around the coast there looking for shipping to raid, and on this particular occasion the chieftain at the time and his son were up where the beacon is now. And at the eastern hall, just under the beacon, they saw some Portuguese ships sheltering from a storm. So the O'Driscolls, it was their modus operandi, they rowed out to them and said, you know, we can guide you into the harbour for safe anchorage and just give us a bit of your wine as a thank you. So as the O'Driscolls guided the Portuguese ships in here, the Portuguese sailors were all clapped in irons. I dare say they had been held down below here, and the O'Driscolls helped themselves to the wine. So a week or so later, the men in Waterford, which is where the wine were bound for, thinking, where the hell's our wine? It's not turned up. And I think we've got a pretty good idea. So they sent a little expeditionary force down here, and sure enough, they got into the harbour here and found the Portuguese ships. Not much wine left on them neither, like, you know. So they raided the ships. They took them back to Waterford, and before they left, they actually fired on Séad Castle and Dunalong Castle on Shirkin. So we think the O'Driscolls were the first ever Irish clan to come under direct naval bombardment, you know. So that's it. Anyway, unfortunately for us, when the guys got back to Waterford, they weren't done there. They said, look, we really do need to teach these O'Driscolls a lesson. So they sent a wee bit of an armada down here. And this time they really did set about us. They started on Shirkin, set fire to Dunalong and the Abbey there. And they went from village to village. Shirkin would have been a series of villages back then, destroying the villages. They then moved on to Spanish Island, where we had another castle and orchards. And then they came into Baltimore. And apparently the fighting here went on all week. The men from Waterford, they then sailed back. They weren't like they were coming here to kind of conquest or anything like that, take territorial grounds, but they went back, but it put a feud to us. Now, some of you may be aware that when they raided the Abbey, there was a rebellion there. The O'Driscolls had constructed the Abbey in 1460-61, and they took it back as a trophy to Waterford. So me and the chieftain, we've been talking about this on numerous occasions. Normally after wine, funnily enough, and we're determined to find out where this bell is, and we might go and have a raid ourselves and try and get it. So that's it. So anyway, that raid, it didn't diminish the O'Driscolls as a military strength. It certainly put a pay to the attacks on Waterford, but later that century, then latter part of the 16th century, the O'Driscolls were probably at the most powerful, really. The English did an audit of all the clans' military strength at that time, and the O'Driscolls had a fleet of about 80 ships at that time, so it was still very powerful. But what was happening during the 16th century, after King Henry VIII had abolished the Catholic Church in England, and they tried to do it here, it didn't work for a variety of reasons. But again, this English paranoia about an attack being mounted on England through Ireland, you know, that really does prevail. The Catholic Spain, Catholic France. So all during the 16th century, England is trying to Anglicise Ireland. Okay, so what happens with the O'Driscolls? They're given a stark choice. You either surrender your lands to the English crown and have them re-granted to you in return for an English title, or we'll take them from you. Certainly around the 1550s, a lot of English people, English adventurers, they knew about the wealthy fishing grounds out here, and they got their eyes on Baltimore. So if the O'Driscolls had not done this, they'd have lost everything. So at that point, the O'Driscolls are loyal to the English crown. The turning point for the O'Driscolls, and indeed the rest of the Irish clans, is the Battle of Kinsale in 1601. So the background to the Battle of Kinsale is the northern chieftains, Hugh O'Donnell and Hugh O'Neill, they're in rebellion. They've had enough of English encroachment on their lands. Catholic Spain, obviously, religion plays a major part in politics at that time, and Catholic Spain, after much persuasion, King Philip decides to send help in the form of a wee armada. Now, from a military point of view, it's not the best military operation ever. The Spanish landing in Kinsale, the Irish army is away up in the north, and it's going to take them 2 months of a particularly bad autumn and winter to meet up with the Spanish there. Now, how the O'Driscolls get involved is reinforcements sent for Kinsale come into O'Driscoll waters and land at Castle Haven just round the coast there. But once the Spanish are in O'Driscoll waters, in O'Driscoll territory, the O'Driscolls seem to sense that the tide is turning, and they throw their lot in with the Spanish and say, right, this is the time, you know, we throw off our loyalty to the English, we can get rid of the English out of Ireland once and for all, okay? And this is not to be, it wasn't the same for a lot of Irish clans. A lot of Irish clans did not want to get involved at all, but the O'Driscolls and the O'Sullivans, they certainly did. So the O'Driscolls, what they did, how they helped the Spanish, is they let the Spanish garrison troops in here, Dunalong and Castle Haven around the coast there. It said Sir Fineen, the chieftain at the time, he retreated to one of his castles inland. His sons, Donald and Connor, they play an active part in this conflict. They go up to Kinsale and they join the Spanish-Irish forces up there. So most historians agree that the Battle of Kinsale should have been an Irish victory. By the time the Irish march down from the north and meet up with the Spanish at Kinsale, they outnumber the English about 3-2, and they've got the better ground as well. The Spanish are commanded by a guy called Aguila, a tactical genius. He's fought all over Europe very successfully. He's brilliant, this guy. When the Irish armies come to meet him in Kinsale, they've been surrounded by the English. The Spanish have been surrounded by the English for a couple of months. But Aguila gets word to the Irish to say, all I want you to do is take that hill, look down on the English, give them something to think about, and I'll do the rest. Okay. So first thing that goes wrong the morning of the battle is Hugh O'Donnell. It's a misty morning and he misses his rendezvous. He's wandering around aimlessly. Hugh O'Neill, he gets his troops in order and he actually takes this hill and looks down on the English. And the English commander, at the morning of the battle, he just says the day is lost. He's surrounded by the Spanish and the Irish at this point. So he knows what's going to happen. Now, whatever we're going through Hugh O'Neill's mind, we don't know, but he's got the hill, he's took it, he's looking down the English, but for whatever reason, he then retreats, and the English can't believe their luck. So they ride to the top of the hill, take it themselves, and they've actually caught the Irish in the open retreating. And this is a field day for the English cavalry. The English cavalry is far superior to the Irish cavalry. So they just get into the Irish and they just run amok. The Irish cavalry, the horses are smaller. The Irish cavalry's strength has always been from attacking from woods and forests, where the English are used to fighting in a proper traditional battlefield, if you like. Also, the English have stirrups and the Irish don't. So when you're charging at somebody with a lance, you can absorb the shock of that through your body, through the stirrups into the horse. The Irish have no stirrups and they have short spears. That's how they attack, and it's just no match. It's a complete mismatch from a cavalry point of view. So what that means for the O'Driscolls is once the Irish Spanish forces have been defeated, the English sail into Baltimore to take the surrender of the Spanish who have been garrisoned here. So the Spanish surrender and the English allow them to leave and sail back to Spain. different for the O'Driscolls because they'd be viewed as English subjects, basically. So the chieftain, he pleads his innocence. He said, I didn't really want to help the Spanish. I were overruled by my sons. And he seems to have been believed. It takes 2 or 3 years, but he gets pardoned eventually. Different for his sons, they're on the run for a long time. They actually end up holding up in Kinsale Castle, just around the coast there where Jeremy Irons lives. Okay, and that's a McCarthy castle. Again, going back to the McCarthys, they actually built that castle centuries before, but right on the border between O'Mahony and O'Driscoll territory. So it's basically, you know, we're keeping eyes on you. Don't forget who's the boss. You know, that's what it is. But anyway, that's where Donald and Connor, they end up holding up there. They are surrounded by the English, but they manage to flee and they go back. They go to Spain, like a lot of prominent Irish clans did. They went there. So anyway, the old chieftain here, he's left to face the music, and now he's really trying to save his neck here. So we know for a fact that he emptied his well at the bottom of the eastern wall here. He emptied it of water and he filled it with wine, silver and gold, and he told the English to help themselves. He's really trying to save his neck. And his charm seems to have worked. He gets pardoned eventually. He gets his castles and his lands back, but he has to pay a £500 bond and promise to behave himself. Okay, so he gets everything back. Now, what the English are doing now is the plantation of Ireland as a whole. They've, again, this paranoia about another attack being mounted through Ireland. In the 16th century, they started carving up parcels of land and giving it to notables as estates. This time, they're going to plant just normal working class Protestant settlers as a whole, all over the country. And Baltimore's no exception. So Baltimore's planted with fishermen from Devon and Cornwall. They come in here. So when Sir Finian's been pardoned, he gets everything back. It's the fishermen and the planters who control the harbour and all the commerce. He's lost all his sources of revenue. So he goes into some very confusing land deals with a couple of people. So Walter Coppinger, who's an old English lawyer from Cork, and Sir Thomas Crook, who was the English guy, obviously, in the plantation of Baltimore. Very, very confusing land deals. They really do contradict each other. I actually really went into depth on these. When it comes to the Sack of Baltimore, I'll talk about in a minute. I had a Dutch TV crew come over and they wanted to interview me a couple of months ago about the Sack of Baltimore. So I thought, okay, because there's a couple of conspiracy theories, who was behind the attack on Baltimore. So I thought, right, I need to nail all this stuff down. I need to get it in here, what happened. So I went through all these land deals and I'd got everything. So they came over, really proud of myself, like, you know, I went into that. And they said, oh, Paul, that's too confusing. They'll never understand that. So, oh, geez, you know, so I learned it all for nothing. But anyway, it's all in there. So, there. So anyway, so these land deals, very confusing. And the chieftain, actually, just after the Battle of Kinsale, is described as an old man, but he actually lives until 1630. So God knows what age he actually got to. But he actually loses everything officially. You know, he's been trying to cling on to his castles, his lands. But he loses everything in a court case in 1629 when he's ordered to repay Sir Walter Coppinger about £1,800 of a loan. He can't afford it, so he loses everything officially at that point. Okay, the O'Driscolls, they do make one attempt to get the castle back in 1641. There's a nationwide rebellion. We know they attacked the castle, all the English families who are in here, but it's an unsuccessful attack. Okay. Having said that, the O'Driscolls, we've held on here. It's still the most popular surname in the area, and I know a lot of you will be aware of the phrase of the saying that in Baltimore, if you're not an O'Driscoll, you're probably sleeping with one, which is highly accurate, I'd say. So that we'll park the O'Driscolls there just for now. So anyway, that'll bring us on, so as I say, 1629 with a court case, 1630 the old chieftain dies, 1631 the village is raided by Algerian pirates. Okay, so an audit's been done of Baltimore in 1625 and it's just described as an English town. The O'Driscolls who have remained here have fled to the countryside or the islands. Most prominent ones have fled to Spain. So it's basically a fishing village, a highly lucrative one as well. The fishing industry is really taking off. Okay, so in 1631, the village is raided by these Algerian pirates. So the background to the raid is Algerian pirates. They were frequently attacking shipping off the southern coast. The people living here would have been aware there was a risk from Algerian pirates. It wasn't anything unusual. In 1627, they'd actually raided Iceland and taken over 200 people into captivity there. So Nothing unusual about the raid, only as so much as they actually came on land here. The normal modus operandi was attacking at sea. So the raid was led by a guy called Jans Jansen, who was born Jans Jansen, a Dutchman, but he'd actually converted to Islam or turned Turk, and he took on the name Murat Reis. So Murat Reis, he left Algiers in early part of 1631, and he first sailed into French waters. He attacked a couple of boats there, took the crew captive, sunk the boats. He then moved into English waters. He attacked a boat piloted by a guy called Edward Follett out of Falmouth, takes his crew captive and sinks the boat. And this is on the June 19th. June 19th. June 20th is just off Kinsale, so he's actually motored from English waters into Irish waters. So one of the conspiracy theories is, why did he move so fast from English to Irish waters? What did Edward Follett tell him, that prompted him to come over here so quickly? And we don't really know. But anyway, he finds himself off Kinsale on the morning of June the 20th, and he attacks two fishing boats out of Dungarvan, one piloted by a guy called John Hackett. And what we know of the raid on Baltimore is from John Hackett's confession. Okay, so if we believe what he says that Murat Reis says, I want you to pilot me into Kinsale, I'm going to attack that and take people as slaves. And Hackett says, don't go into Kinsale, it's too hot for you, it's too risky, don't do it. Why not try Baltimore instead? So why does he say Baltimore? We don't know. Maybe he had family in Kinsale. Maybe he knew that the English colony was here. Again, religion plays a massive part in politics at that time. Protestant settlers here. He was a Catholic himself, but was that one of the reasons behind it? But anyway, he ends up here just outside the harbour's mouth here at 10 o'clock at night on June the 20th. So he's got his own crew. He's got two boats with about 280 men. He's now got the sailors he's captured from the French boats, the English boats and the Irish boats out of Dungarvan on board. And what he immediately does, once he weighs anchor just outside the entrance to the harbour, he goes on a reconnaissance mission. So it's described, he took his 10 best men, he wrapped his oars in corkling material to then the sound, a stealthy reconnaissance mission, and he came into Baltimore to suss it out. So it said he spent 5 glasses in and around Baltimore, which is about 2 hours, doing a reconnaissance mission, sails back out to his boats, and he said he cheered up his men by saying, we're good to go, this looks like a good place for attack. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, he loads the vast majority of men into his boats. And again, very stealthy operation. They're rowing very quietly into the cove area, which is straight opposite us there. The village at the time, or Baltimore, was split into 2 settlements, really. The English planters, fishermen, they were in the cove area. And then there was a settlement around the castle here. So they sail in, start for 2 o'clock in the morning. They land about 3 o'clock in the morning, and he divides his men up to he has 9 men to each house. There's about 26 houses in the cove there, so 9 men to each house. They surround them, and again, it's silent, it's stealthy. Okay, so once they surround each house, what they then do is they set fire to the roof of each house. These were thatched cottages, so the inhabitants would have woke up, smoke, fire. They've been coughing, choking. They'd have spluttered out into the clear air, and they would then be met by the most horrific sight. So up to this point, the attacking Algerians would have been very, very quiet. At this point, they employed psychological warfare and would have been shouting at these people, trying to just cow them into submission. And these guys would have been such a fearsome sight to these humble villagers. So Murat Reis's men were Janissaries, which were like the Marines of the Islamic world at that time. And these guys would have had turbans on, white baggy pants, tunics, and bare arms, big curved swords, muskets, torches, and these guys would have been shouting the most horrific obscenities just to cow these people into submission. They don't want to hurt anybody. They want to get these people back to Algiers and get them sold in the slave markets and make some money off them. 2 men are killed defending their families, their houses, but they end up with about 100 people from that raid on the cove area. Having got 100 people from there, they decide to attack this part of the town. Now, Murat Reis is quite perturbed. This attack has not raised any kind of sound, any kerfuffle, I suppose, in this part of the town. So he's thinking, I don't know, am I being led into a trap here? I'm not sure. So he leaves a skeleton force with 100 people he's captured. He leaves 60 in an ambush formation between here and the cove, and the rest of his men attack this part of the town. And they ransack about 40 houses, but they only take a further 10 people. So obviously these people had heard the attack, and most of them had fled. At this point, a man lets off a musket shot defending his house, which alerts another man in this part of the town who starts beating a drum. And when Murat Reis and his forces hear this drum being beaten, they automatically think that soldiers must be here, and they decide to not chance to look any further, and they retreat at that point. Okay, so he ends up with a total of 109 people. They get them out to the boats, just anchored outside the beacon there. 2 elderly people are sent back. 107 people are then taken back to Algiers. It takes them 5 weeks to get there. But when they get there, we know they'll survive the journey. Again, this kind of activity was semi-legitimate business. So there were a missionary in Algiers called Pierre Dan, a French missionary, and he was there to administer to the needs of the Christian slaves who've been taken to the slave markets there. And he wrote a harrowing account how he witnessed mother and child being separated, husband and wife being separated, never to see each other again, you know, quite horrific. Now, one of the features of these raids, what they were looking for really is wealthy people they could ransom. As I said, it's a semi-legitimate business. There are actually ransoming companies set up in London just to basically ransom people who've been taken into captivity. Where Murat Reis didn't get lucky, there were no wealthy people. These were just fishermen. Where he did get lucky is that most of the people he took were women and girls who would have fetched a very high price in the slave markets in Algiers. And unfortunately for them, they'd have been confined to life as concubines or have gone into harems, you know. A few years after the raid, 4 years after the raid, the English consul in Algiers, he's been tasked to find out what's happened to the Baltimore captives. And he writes that there's only 70 of them worth ransoming or available for ransom. The others have either died or turned Turk, i.e. converted to Islam. And once they converted to Islam, the English authorities had no more interest in them. He does say one woman has managed to ransom herself, but frustratingly doesn't give a name, so we don't know which one. A good 15 years after the raid, this is during Cromwell's time, a series of ships are sent down to Algiers to rescue or to free the people, English people who've been taken into captivity there. And 2 women who share similar surnames to 2 other women taken from here are freed on that mission. It could have been them, or it could just be coincidence, so we don't really know. One thing for sure is that they would never have come back to Baltimore. Baltimore goes into a steep decline after the Sack of Baltimore. Fearful of another attack, most villagers go inland and found what is now Skibbereen. And another thing, it's just coincidental, is that after the Sack of Baltimore, the pilchard fishing, which were rife here during the time of the plantation, the pilchards disappear, so it really does go into a decline. And it stays that way really until the early part of the 19th century. There's a couple of English audits in the 18th and early 19th century that just describes Baltimore as a decaying fishing village. This place itself, Séad Castle, it's up for auction in Dublin in 1703, and it's just described as the ruins of a very old castle then in 1703. So it's really, what we think happened to the castle, I should point out, is that we know Cromwellian troops were stationed here in 1649. When they leave with no record of anybody living here, so the scorched earth policy that Cromwell employed throughout Ireland, probably that happened here. They probably set fire to the place and just left the 4 walls standing there. So Baltimore doesn't really get back on its feet until the early part of the 19th century. England invokes the Act of Union, which abolishes the Dublin Parliament and its direct rule from London. Now, a lot of the MPs that were returned to the Dublin Parliament, they were resistant to this because they had an easy life. They were getting paid for basically doing nothing. You know, Baltimore would have been described as a rotten borough. There weren't many people here, but people were getting an MP's salary for being returned to the Dublin Parliament. So to compensate these people, there's money made available to places like Baltimore. The First Fruit Fund that founds St Matthew's Church there, which I think was 1817. Yeah. So money starts to flow in, and that's when the village starts to take on its modern appearance. The sailing club, where we're going to be going shortly, for a buffet, That's first built in 1838. A lot of the fishermen's cottages, terraced houses, they're all built around this time. So Baltimore starts to revive. And then, as we all know, the Great Famine hits in 1845, and Baltimore, Skibbereen are as badly affected as anywhere else. So that revival is stopped right there and then. So it really takes the appointment of a wonderful man called Father Charles Davies. He was appointed the parish priest to the area in the 1870s. And when he comes in here, he's actually appalled by what he finds. He finds that even though the famine's supposedly been over for 20 odd years, famine conditions still exist, still prevail. And what he's also horrified is that the harbour, the waters here are actually teeming with mackerel. But the guys have nothing to catch them with. You know, during the famine years, you'd have sold everything off or pawned everything, you know, and after the famine ended, people just had no money to buy boats and fishing nets, okay? So he actually grabs 3 fishermen from Cape Clear and he goes over to London and he's granted an audience with Queen Victoria. And he uses the phrase, the fish are knocking on the door, but we haven't got a bucket to put them in. So she's moved by his plight and introduces him to another wonderful person called Baroness Coutts, Britain's wealthiest woman, maybe Britain's wealthiest person of Coutts banking. And she gives Father Charles Davies £10,000 to get the fishing industry off its feet in Baltimore. So, first of all, he buys some boats from the Isle of Man, gets those over here, okay. The original pier where the sailing club is there, that's really in shallow water. So they use the money to build the southern pier where the ferries go out to Shirkin and Cape Clear from, and that's opened in 1883. So now they've got the boats and they've got the pier. What they haven't got then is the knowledge. You know, you can land the fish, but what do you do with it? So he uses some of that money to open a fisheries school, and that opens in 1897.